Thank you all of you for coming. I live in the United States, so there may be a language problem. I hope you can keep up with my English, and I'll try to speak slowly so the translators can do their work. The talk, I think the title of the talk is Promise and Perils of Postcolonial Theory. Is that right? Something like that. What that suggests is an examination of two things. One is the boilerplate announcements by postcolonial theory of its intentions and what appear to be quite promising agenda on the part of the theory and the theorists, but weighed against the reality of what the actual success of those claims are. Now, this is not an easy topic to take up because it's not quite clear what postcolonial studies or postcolonial theory is, even to its practitioners. On the one hand, one can think of postcolonial studies in a very anodyne way, which is simply the study or the examination of countries that were once colonized. Now, if this is what it means, then that study is compatible with any number of substantive theories and substantive propositions and arguments about how colonial and postcolonial societies work. So the area itself would be quite broad and not reducible or identifiable with any particular theory. Some do think of postcolonial studies in that way, as just an arena where ideas are battled, are fought out. But for many central practitioners of postcolonial studies, the identification of the field is made with certain core ideas and core propositions, such that it actually seems to suggest real arguments and theories about how the world works, which cluster together, which have some degree of consistency with each other, and which can be identified as maybe a research program or a theory of some kind. Now, indeed, in much of its rhetoric, postcolonial studies, as it becomes a theory, postcolonial theory, claims not only to have certain central ideas and propositions in common, but claims also to have internalized and surpassed the most influential and powerful theoretical frameworks that we've inherited for the study of the developing world, namely Marxism on the one hand and liberalism on the other. Postcolonial theory often presents itself as the successor to these theoretical traditions, indeed as the theory which makes up for many of their shortcomings. Now, if this is to be taken seriously, and I suggest we do, and because they do, and much of the intellectual world seems to, then it behooves us to try to look at those practitioners of the theory, those components of the theory, which make some claims about how the world actually works, which are empirically oriented, historically oriented, which do actual research, and which try to, from that research, generate knowledge claims about the world. That was what I decided to do in this book of mine that Samir mentioned, and it is what I'm going to examine today in this lecture. And that was why I decided to focus on one particular stream within postcolonial theory that's known as subaltern studies. Subaltern studies started as a project which brought together historians of South Asia, which undertook to examine the history of South Asia from a kind of history from below perspective, which quite early on then morphed into something more than just a historiographical commitment. It turned into a substantive, evolving, but substantive body of arguments about not just how the global South works, but about how capitalism works, how the South differs from the advanced world, and what this means for our understanding of modernity more generally. So subaltern studies is something that I've taken as an exemplar of some key ideas and developments within postcolonial studies. It does not by any means exhaust postcolonial theory. I don't mean to suggest that it does, and some people have questioned why I focus on it since there's much that is outside of it. There's the cultural theory that's come out of postcolonial theory, the literary theory. There's a lot going on, and I don't intend to suggest that this is exhaustive of it. It is, however, representative, I think, of postcolonial theory. They certainly seem to think that they are. The key practitioners of subaltern studies have presented themselves within the rubric of postcolonial theory. The central texts that of recent years that summarize and present and try to synthesize postcolonial theory almost always include subaltern studies as a very important stream within the literature. So I don't think it's controversial to say that as goes subaltern studies, so goes at least a big chunk of postcolonial theory as well. So much of what I'm going to say today comes out of an examination of that line of research and its cognate programs, people who are around it and who've been influenced by it and who affirm its arguments. The conclusions that I wish to draw are conclusions, therefore, that I think are germane for the wider body of literature as well. So what are these core themes that subaltern studies puts forward and which I think resonate with the wider commitments of postcolonial theory? There are three that I'm going to focus on in this lecture. And my argument is going to be that while the three commitments are all laudable, while they are actually commitments that all of us should subscribe to, the actual arguments that subaltern studies and postcolonial theory has put forward do not, in fact, further the agenda that's announced by the claims. Indeed, in my view, the commitments that they announce fidelity to are in tension with the arguments that they've developed, indeed are undermined by the arguments that they've developed, so that the pretentious term for this is they become antinomies. That the arguments actually contradict the claims that they seek to make, and if that's the case, then, and if the tension between them is not resolvable, as I think, in fact, it is not, the conclusion to draw is that the theory actually ought to be abandoned, which is what I will urge in the end, and I hope to escape alive from the room once I do so. Well, there are three claims that the theorists make. Let me lay them out, and then I'll go examine them in a serial fashion. The first is a critique of liberalism. Postcolonial theory, in the form of subaltern studies, but also more widely, presents itself as a critic of liberal theory, which is seen to be some sort of ideological gloss on capitalism. Secondly, there's a critique of Eurocentrism. This is famous. Everyone knows this. Every card-carrying postcolonial theorist seeks to critique Eurocentrism, and subaltern studies is no different in this respect. Thirdly, there is the critique and rejection of universalizing theories. Universalizing theories is a pretentious bit of jargon. What it means is theories which insist that their claims have validity across geographical and cultural differences and are not specific to any particular region of the world. Hence, even though they're locally generated, they're universally applicable. These three claims are all that are central to not just subaltern studies, but postcolonial theory, and I will suggest that the theory, in fact, contradicts all three of the commitments to which they announce their fidelity. So let me start with the first one, the critique of liberalism. Now, the idea is that liberal theory is some sort of a carrier of an ideological obfuscation and ideological defense of the dominant order, globalizing capitalism, or before that, a colonial capitalism. Liberals are seen as the defenders of these orders, and postcolonial theorists rightly announce some degree of suspiciousness of this theoretical tradition. Now, in fact, in some of the central works of postcolonial theory, what you have is an internalization of the core nostrums of liberal theory. Where you see this most, I think, clearly is in the historical sociology that's been generated by one of its most influential members, whose name is Ranjit Guha. Ranjit Guha was the, I think it's fair to say he was the guiding spirit in the early years of postcolonial theory, and his two key works, Elementary Aspects of Peasant Insurgency in Colonial India and Dominance Without Hegemony, are both seen as pillars, as foundational pillars, providing the historical arguments on which the sociological claims of subaltern studies are made and are generated. Guha's central argument, it is a very important one, and I think it's the most elaborate argument that's come out of postcolonial studies on why the East differs fundamentally from the West, and why Western concepts are highly suspicious when they're carried over from Western universities or Western intellectuals to the non-Western world. Guha is the person who has generated the most ambitious historical argument as to why the expansion of modernity into the East morphed in such a way that there's a chasm separating the two. The argument goes something like this, that the theorists of 19th century liberalism and the critics of 19th century capitalism both drew upon certain basic cultures, assumptions about political culture, and assumptions about how the world works, which reflected the reality of Europe. The assumption was then that those same concepts could carry over into analyzing the non-Western world. Concepts that both descriptive content about concepts like capitalism, political rights, interests, etc., that agents might have. Also normative ones about what justice amounts to, what fairness is, what kind of social order conduces to our basic values. Guha makes the argument that the way the East developed ended up being so different from the West that all these foundational assumptions of 19th century post-Enlightenment thought end up being very problematic. Why did it develop differently from the West? This is the key argument. The argument is that in the West, the ending of the ancien regime, the ending of the old order, of the traditional order, was brought about by something called a revolutionary bourgeoisie. Capitalism came about in the West, and it was brought about by this rising capitalist class that in the 17th, or from the 17th to the early 19th century, rose up, smashed the old order, got rid of the old economic relations, which is feudalism, did away with feudalism, and installed a twofold new order. On the one hand, an order that economically could be described as capitalist. A new order in which the economy was organized around capitalist lines, and more importantly, installed an encompassing, consensual, liberal political order. Now, the hallmark for him of this transformation is that it took what were two separate spheres in life, which is the sphere of the elites, their political culture, their normative orientation, and the sphere of the subaltern the dominated classes, the laboring classes, peasants and workers. They had been two separate worlds under feudalism. And the elites under feudalism simply exercised their power by outright domination of the subaltern classes. What this bourgeoisie did in the West, Guha says, is that it not only transformed the economy, but it brought the subaltern classes into the same political culture as the elites. And you, for the first time, had one encompassing political culture, the center of which, the pillar of which, was that this new class took it upon itself to speak not just for its own interests, but for the common interest. The way Guha puts it is, the bourgeoisie took it upon itself to speak for all the nation. It exercised its power, therefore, through the consent of those that it dominated. And so a whole new political culture was created, which was secular, in which subaltern agents became aware of their own interests, learned to fight for those interests, and where politics was for the first time organized around mutual accommodation of everybody's interests. What happened in the East, he says, is when capitalists went to the East in two forms, either in the form of colonial capital or the indigenous capitalists that came out of the economic development of the global South itself. Both of these kinds of capitalists forswore this mission that Western capitalists had taken up. Whereas Western capitalists took it upon themselves to integrate the political order, to bring it together and speak for all the nation, capital in the East, Guha very famously says, it abandoned this universalizing mission. Instead of taking its interests and combining them with others to create a universal interest, what it did instead was secured its own rule through outright coercion and domination, and instead of therefore bringing the subaltern and the elite orders together into one, kept them separate. Because it kept them separate, it did not transform the political culture of the subaltern classes. That culture remained religious, mired in tradition, a culture in which community values always supervened on individual self-interest. Individual interests, which are the hallmark of politics in the West, never became a fulcrum for political contestation in the East. Politics in the East remained politics around community and culture, not around material values. Because of this, he says, theories from the West that go to the East and assume that peasants or workers are motivated by their own interests, will pursue their interests, will organize around them, inevitably end up misunderstanding what's actually going on. The agents in the East are still motivated by the same, as you might think of it, archaic notions, traditional notions of selfhood and politics as they were in the earlier times. So what separates the East from the West, then, is that the East was never able to enjoy the benefits of a liberal, cosmopolitan, enlightened capitalist class. Now, that is an argument which Guha puts forward from the 80s all the way into the 90s. And if you look at the chief works of subaltern studies and their followers, it is ratified and affirmed and pushed forward by literally every one of them. It is the foundation on which the historical argument for the separation of East and West rests. Now, there's 2 points about this argument. The first is it has virtually no empirical basis. It was a very popular argument in the 19th century and in the historiography of the English Revolution and the French Revolution. These were the classic, what's called bourgeois revolutions. It was a very popular argument into the 1930s and 40s. But by the late 1960s, early 70s, it was almost universally rejected, and it has continued to be rejected by the historiographical profession and by historians, specialists on both of these countries. What's remarkable about postcolonial theory is that it's continued to advance this line of argument literally 3 decades after which no respectable historian continued to defend it. And what's even more remarkable is that all the elite universities that have feted and promoted this theory as the cutting edge of theory, all of these universities house those very historians who would never take the actual historical argument seriously. So it's an interesting fact about our intellectual culture that postcolonial theory has been able to continue advancing these arguments at a time when nobody who actually studies these issues believes them anymore. Now, so the first issue is there's no empirical warrant for them. It is true that there was a bourgeoisie in the West. It is true that by the 19th century, it was politically the dominant class in the West. But it is absolutely not true that this class of people ever fought for a consensual, liberal, encompassing order. In fact, the history of the West is that capitalist classes, as they achieved political power, used that power to exclude and to marginalize laboring classes to the best of their ability. And what they created after 1640 in England, or in 1688 in England, and 1789 in France, were what you might call bourgeois oligarchies. These were social orders in which dominant classes used their political power to gain exclusive control over the state, and indeed to turn that power against those classes, the subaltern classes, which subaltern studies takes to be the beneficiaries of bourgeois power. Now, Guha is right that in the non-Western world, capitalists never fought in any meaningful way for democracy. They didn't in Africa, they didn't in Asia, they didn't in Latin America. But what that means is they were acting more or less like their European counterparts, not in any different way from them. And it is also true that the new orders that were established in the post-colonial world tended to be orders in which the elites took a, at best, lukewarm attitude towards democracy. But that non-encompassing order, that non-consensual order, is exactly what one found in Europe for more than 150 years after the bourgeoisie came to power. So insofar as there's supposed to be 2 different paths to modernity, one which is the hegemonic consensual European road, and the other which is this broken, oligarchic, chaotic post-colonial road, it's a fiction. There are many differences between them, but the commitments of the capitalist class is not one of them. The unfortunate truth is capitalists in the East were no better no worse than capitalists in the West. They had the same basic commitment, which is to seek to make profits and to seek to secure their power to the best of their ability. Now, that's the factual. How does this undermine the commitment to critique of liberalism? Well, the picture of the bourgeoisie that Guha puts forward is a picture that actually was created in the middle decades of the 19th century by ideologues and intellectuals who were working with newly forming liberal and bourgeois parties and who created a mythology around those parties to justify the political programs of newly arising capitalist classes. This idea of a liberal and cosmopolitan bourgeoisie is a fiction created by liberal ideologues in the 19th century as part of the political project of, to use a hackneyed term, as the political project of the bourgeoisie. When subaltern studies in Guha put forward this picture of how Western capitalism was different from the East, the picture they're putting forward is one that whitewashes the history of what capitalism was. And it is not therefore surprising that Guha's main criticism of the colonial rulers of India is that they did not live up to their own values. They failed to live up to their own values. Now, what values are those? They're values that they never had. They were in fact living up to their values. The values that he thinks they betrayed were ones that he is imputing to them because he's internalized a discourse which was an apologia for this class of people. So if one agrees that the picture that's been put forward by subaltern studies is one that is fictitious, it ends up being not just an empirical mistake, but an ideological argument as well. An ideological argument that whitewashes the actual history of capitalism and would ends up putting forward a picture of capitalism where if it's just capitalists, which if they just lived up to their potential, we could get a more just and more humane social order. All right, let's go to the second issue, which is the critique of Eurocentrism. This is probably what postcolonial theory, I think, is most famous for, most well known for, which is that theories inherited from the Enlightenment tradition are taken to be parochial and which illicitly take to the non-Western world assumptions and ideas and values which are really quite specific to the Western world, and in so doing misunderstand the real dynamics of what's going on in the East. Well, this is what we understand as Eurocentrism. Well, do they succeed? Do postcolonial theorists succeed in criticizing Eurocentrism? I think no, and this is where I think my book has raised some controversy. In my opinion, they promote Eurocentrism. They don't undermine it. How do they do so? They do so in two ways. First of all, postcolonial theory, as many theorists today outside of postcolonial theory do, they promote the idea and the importance of culture as a source of social agency, social difference, social institutions, etc. They insist that traditional theories have undervalued and underestimated the importance of culture. Well, that may be true. I don't think it is, but maybe it's true. But postcolonial theory goes one step further. It not only stresses the importance of culture, it posits culture as the source of social and institutional differences across geographical regions. This is especially so if you look at Latin American subaltern studies and postcolonial theory as it's practiced among Latin American specialists. The notion that there is this unbridgeable, essential cultural divide between the advanced world and the developing world, or between East and West, that ends up being an argument that is quite central to postcolonial theory's project. But it's an argument which doesn't simply note the existence of cultural differences. It ends up pointing to those cultural differences as having two effects. They are the source of all the other differences, and the culture itself ends up being an unchanging, unevolving, ever-present fact about those parts of the world. Now, once you point to the culture of that part of the world as being the source of all social difference, it's very hard for that argument to not end up reifying that culture, to not be an argument that seeks culture as its own internally driven dynamic, not a consequence of evolving differences in social institutions and social structures, but as its own self-originating source which generates the differences that we're seeing in structures and institutions. This is very, very reminiscent of colonial ideology. In colonial ideology, and indeed in 20th century imperial ideology, the recipients or the victims of colonial aggression are oftentimes seen as people who do not understand those same values and do not appreciate the same values and same orientations as those of the West. And that the reason they do not is because their cognitive orientation is so fundamentally different from the West that those conceptions which we have, which include notions of rights, of justice, of morality, etc., simply don't apply to them. In order to understand those parts of the world, therefore, you have to leave your culture behind and create some kind of gestalt switch where you become one of them. This was very, very reminiscent of colonial ideology, and if you read either whether you're reading Anibal Quijano or Walter Mignolo, looking at Latin American realities or post-colonial subaltern studies for India, you get very much a similar effect in the arguments. This is especially so in the second domain, in which I think this culturalism becomes really visible, which is in their understanding of social agency. That is to say, their understanding of how people are, what people's political psychology and political motivations are. What is absolutely central to that argument in post-colonial theory is that Western politics it rests on a certain conception of the individual, which is a bounded conception of the individual, in which people understand themselves as separable from their community, and in which they have a conception of their interests and their material well-being, which is distinct from that of the social community or kinship group in which they belong. Whereas in Latin America or Africa or India, the individual finds it impossible to separate himself from his community. And so when he engages in politics, the worry about what his material interests are or her material interests are, how the political program or political struggles will affect him, takes at best a subordinate position. What he's motivated by is the collective good, the community good, etc., etc. So these agents, individuals in the East, therefore, simply are not geared and motivated by the same concerns as those in the West. Now, why does this matter? Well, then if you have, for example, a social theory which says there's such a thing as human rights, there's such a thing as universal rights that all people should have, that political programs should have something to do with the individual interests of everyone within a community, that means these conceptions have to be ditched. Now, it is perfectly legitimate, I think, to be suspicious of arguments that seek to defend, say, American aggression or British aggression through the language of rights, that we're going there to civilize, to teach democracy to these countries, to these people. That's absolutely, it's true that those claims are made, and it is true that behind them oftentimes lies a very aggressive and violent political program. That's absolutely true. But being suspicious of claims for justice and democracy and rights doesn't mean to being suspicious of the very idea of rights and justice and democracy, which is what we get with post-colonial theory. Once you have a conception of the East in which an unchanging underlying culture makes for an unbridgeable gap between East and West, and once you have a conception of people and subjects or agents in the East in which they're unmotivated by these basic concerns, basic needs, ideas of their material well-being, what you have ended up with is not a critique of Eurocentrism, but in fact, it's revitalization. Because what was at the core of the Eurocentric ideologies of the 19th and 20th century, what was at the very core of them, was this notion of deep, unchanging cultural differences between the East and the West. Cultural differences which exist because of the unchanging psychology of the non-West. All right. From this comes now the final and the third and final pillar of post-colonial theory, which is the rejection of universalizing claims and universalizing theories. Here, again, there are two problems that arise. It is, of course, true that theories which are illicitly or wrongly universalizing ought to be ditched. But this is not the argument that comes out of postcolonial theory. It is not the trivial and utterly banal argument that unwarranted and illicit universalizing claims ought to be rejected, because who would say that's not true? Who would say you shouldn't reject them? That simply amounts to saying wrong theory shouldn't be accepted. The argument that comes out of postcolonial theory is that there's a problem with the very idea of a universalizing theory. Now, that shouldn't be surprising to you, because if you agree that the East, or the non-advanced world, is centrally characterized by an unchanging and unyielding cultural difference from the West, then of course it's going to follow that theories coming out of the West with a certain conception of universal interests or universal needs that people have, those theories are going to be highly problematic. But once we reject the idea that there is this unbridgeable cultural difference, it's no longer the case that there is something automatically worrisome about universalizing theories. Now it becomes an empirical question whether or not any given theory is wrongly universalizing or not. In postcolonial studies, this very basic and I think quite commonsensical approach to universalizing theories is rejected. The consequence of that is many theories and many concepts that are, I think, quite valid in their universal scope, in being universalizing, are also thereby called into question and rejected. And what that ends up then giving us is a theoretical framework that can't make sense of certain basic processes in the world. So what are some of these universal, I think, appropriately universal ideas that are rejected? Well, one is that there are certain basic needs that everybody has all around the world, regardless of the culture in which they live. In my book, I focus on one and a half. That it's two, but the second one I don't spend a lot of time defending, because I want to just try to keep the theory as conservative as possible. But the two that I think are quite obvious and are relevant across cultures, one is a need for basic physical well-being that, so far as we know, everybody is motivated by, regardless of culture and regardless of time. And the second, I think, is a need for some degree of autonomy, or what you might call self-determination. That is, in putting it very bluntly, people don't like being bossed around. And it doesn't matter if they're Muslim or Hindu or Christian. That amounts to some kind of need for autonomy and some recognition of autonomy. I think these are universal, and I think they form the basis of a great deal of the structural and institutional facts that we see all around the world, and they certainly form the basis for virtually every political movement in the modern era that we've seen that's been recognized as some kind of mass movement. Subaltern studies and postcolonial theory not only implicitly but explicitly reject the idea of universal needs and even basic needs. A second concept which they reject, and this is curious, and they do have an argument for it, but it's a weak one. A second concept that they urge us to reject is the idea of a universalizing capitalism. Devesh Chakrabarty is quite explicit about this, as are others. Now, this is a decidedly odd argument if you think about it. On what grounds would anybody say that capitalism has not universalized itself in this day and age, after the last 40 years, when you've seen the biggest wave of depeasantization or proletarianization in global history? Well, the argument that's made is that capitalism, Chakrabarty says, has globalized, but it hasn't universalized. And what on earth could that mean? Well, what it means is it has spread across the world in a manner of speaking, but it has not universalized core properties, which subaltern studies and the theorists of subaltern studies think were central to the European incarnation of capitalism. So as it globalized, it did not spread into the rest of the world certain properties, certain institutional mutations which it had brought about in Europe. And because of that, because it didn't, it is valid to say that it hasn't adequately or appropriately universalized itself. Now, what is it that it didn't spread? What are these properties? Didn't create a consensual order. That's one. Okay, we've already dealt with that. The other is a bizarre argument. It's that it continued to reproduce or abide by very many social differences, religious differences, caste differences, gender differences, and hence it did not homogenize the social landscape. The argument is if capitalism had truly universalized itself, it would have homogenized the social landscape. And that's a bizarre argument, because where has it ever homogenized the social landscape? The idea that a universalizing capital brings every social practice under its sway, transforms it, subsumes it into itself, is an idea that gives capitalism a kind of power that it has never ever had, whether it's in Europe or anywhere else. And it creates a litmus test for the concept of capitalism that it could not possibly ever pass, not just in the East, but even in the West. It's a bizarre argument, but it is probably the most common that you find in post-colonial studies. And it's quite remarkable that it hasn't been challenged more widely and more effectively. Finally, the claim that comes out of this argument, which is that universalizing theories are suspect because they illicitly homogenize the social world. So the idea is, whenever you take a theory which says India is capitalist, Nigeria is capitalist, and England is capitalist, what you're in fact saying is they're all the same. And you're ignoring all the differences between them. So, what you need is theories which don't subsume these various different regions under the same category, and instead what you need is theories which highlight all the differences between them. But again, this is a bizarre argument. First of all, it's wrong. When you say that England and Nigeria and the United States are all capitalist, you're not saying they're all the same. You're simply saying they share certain properties. They're going to be very different in other ways, but this is one property that they share, and it happens to be an important one because it imparts to these countries certain consequences of being capitalist, which, despite all their differences, those consequences are very important ones. It does not by any means say that everything else about them is the same. And what's remarkable, again, about this argument is that it is such a simple distinction to make. That if you don't make the distinction, it's not just this or that universalizing theory that ends up being suspicious. Any general concept ends up being suspicious, because you cannot have any general argument about anything which doesn't abstract away from certain differences. So all general categories now the trick with that is try doing any social analysis that eschews general concepts, any analysis whatsoever. So the problem is, if you take these arguments seriously, they not only undermine the claims that are being made by post-colonial theorists, they make it impossible to have a theory of any kind. Now, to conclude then, what's the way out of this? I think the way out of this is what was being promulgated and advanced by social theory for 150-odd years before post-colonial theory came around, and which I think will continue to be advanced once post-colonial theory is gone from the scene, which I don't think is going to happen anytime soon, but it will eventually happen, which is simply that you develop an analysis of capitalism which shows that diversity exists even as capitalism globalizes and universalizes across the world. Now, that diversity can be generated in a variety of ways. Some diversity is created by capitalism itself. So capitalism itself, because it spreads across the world in a highly uneven fashion, in an episodic fashion, changes institutions in such a way that they are quite distinct from each other, even within the economic sphere itself. Secondly, there's differences which capitalism captures and then intensifies. It doesn't create them ex nihilo itself, but it captures them and intensifies them. In the colonial world, one was the subsumption of various kinds of chiefdoms and tribal identities into itself. This happened especially in Africa, where chiefly authority was used to create a labor force. In the mining industry, in the labor-intensive textile industries, chiefs were used as labor conduits, but that required heightening and intensifying their authority over the local population, which also heightened and intensified a lot of the cultural and social practices of the chiefs. In fact, quite often it artificially created them, where they were used to be quite minor. This is an example. Another example of where religious differences were used or heightened by managers, by employers, in order to be able to better manipulate the labor force in these countries. That's another example of how capitalism captures diversity and then intensifies it. And a third route for capitalism to abide by lots of diversity is diversity that simply it has no stake in, and which it's happy to see persist because it's indifferent to it. And what this means is all those various social practices that agents have, which employers or capitalists are happy to see perpetuate themselves because they have no direct bearing on the one thing that capitalists are interested in, which is making a profit for themselves. Now, this fact that capitalism can universalize, even in the midst of enormous diversity, in fact, reproduce the diversity, tolerate that diversity, is one that was recognized by these supposedly deficient Enlightenment theories that we are urged to reject, but in fact are quite capable of doing all those things which I think postcolonial theory and subaltern studies have shown to be incapable of doing. So if I entirely laud the critique of liberal apologia for capitalism, the critique of Eurocentrism, the suspiciousness of universalizing theories, the problem with subaltern studies and with postcolonial theory is not that it has these commitments, but that it can't possibly carry them out. What we need, I think, in this world today is a more adequate theory, which is more, I think, has greater fidelity to these commitments, which is capable of carrying them out, and which is able to do the two things which postcolonial theory claims to do but cannot. One, provide an explanatory theory of how our world has evolved and how it is now today functioning and what the dynamics of that world are. And secondly, to provide some platform for political and moral critique in order to be able to develop both an analysis of what's wrong with the world today and some sense of what a more just and humane social order might look like. I don't think you can do either of those things without a genuinely and steadfastly universalizing theory and without some sort of conception of our basic humanity, which binds all of us together across cultures and across regions, instead of this, what we will get with postcolonial theory, which is an endless proliferation of localisms and nativisms. I'll stop there.
All right.